In August of 1894, while summer still held tight to the shores of Lake Superior, Margaret Maggie Sullivan stood alone in her yard outside Bayfield, Wisconsin, and drove a wooden stake into the ground. She tied a length of string to it, pulled the line tight, and placed another stake 16 feet away. Anyone watching would have assumed she was planting a small garden or marking a fence line. No one guessed she was about to dig a hole that would change how an entire town thought about winter survival. Maggie was only 23 years old, but her life had already hardened her in ways most people never faced. 2 years earlier, her husband Thomas had been killed in a logging accident. A snapped cable, a falling tree, a moment that ended everything. Since then, she had lived alone in their small house, surviving on careful spending, long hours of work, and an understanding that winter in northern Wisconsin showed no mercy to those who made mistakes. Firewood was life. Without it, the house became a wooden coffin once the snow came and the temperature fell below zero. Everyone in Bayfield knew that. They stacked their wood outside, under simple lean-to roofs or tarps weighed down with stones. Sometimes the wood stayed dry. Often it did not. Rain soaked it. Snow melted into it. Warm days pulled moisture into the logs, and cold nights froze it solid. That was normal. People complained about it, cursed at their stoves, and burned more wood to make up for the loss. That was simply how winter worked. Maggie knew better, because she had been paying attention. Her first winter alone had nearly broken her. She burned through far more wood than expected, feeding the stove constantly, fighting smoke that stung her eyes and fires that refused to burn hot. The second winter was no better. She started keeping track: how much wood she used, how often she had to tend the fire, how much heat she actually felt. She noticed that the wettest wood burned the worst. Frozen logs hissed and steamed. Half the heat went into melting ice instead of warming her house. She did the math at her kitchen table by lamplight. A house like hers should need about 6 cords of wood for a winter. But if half that wood was damp or frozen, she was really burning closer to 8 cords just to get the heat of 6. At $3 a cord, that difference mattered. It was money she did not have. That was when she decided to stop accepting what everyone else called normal. The earth below her feet held a secret most people ignored. Below the frost line, about 4 feet down in Wisconsin soil, the temperature did not care about winter or summer. It stayed steady around 45 to 50 degrees all year. At that depth, nothing froze. And because cool air held less moisture, the underground air stayed dry. Wood kept there would not absorb water. It would stay seasoned, ready to burn properly no matter what storms raged above. So Maggie planned an underground shed just for firewood. The idea spread through town before her shovel ever hit the ground. People talked. They laughed. A widow digging a hole to store wood sounded foolish at best. Everyone knew underground spaces were damp. Root cellars were damp. Basements were damp. Why would anyone put firewood underground on purpose? Maggie did not argue. She marked out a rectangle 10 feet wide and 16 feet long. That gave her 160 square feet of floor space, enough to store 4 cords of wood with room to move and stack properly. She planned to dig 6 feet deep, well below the frost line. Stone-lined walls would hold the earth back and allow air to move. A timber roof covered with earth would protect the chamber from rain and snow. A sloped ramp would allow easy access even in winter. It was simple in design and brutal in execution. She began digging in early September, after the harvest was finished and before the ground hardened. Bayfield soil was unforgiving. Glacial clay mixed with stones left behind by ancient ice. When wet, it clung to the shovel like glue. When dry, it turned hard as brick. Some days she made good progress. Other days, she fought every inch. Each morning she rose at dawn, ate a small breakfast, and went to work. She filled the spade with 15 or 20 pounds of earth, climbed out of the pit using a rough ladder, dumped the load onto the growing mound around the hole, then climbed back down, again and again, hundreds of times a day. Within 3 days, blisters formed on her hands. By the 5th day, they broke open and bled. She wrapped them in cloth and kept going. Her back became a constant ache, tightening each night and protesting every morning. Her shoulders burned from lifting thousands of pounds of earth, load by load. She rested when her body demanded it, but she never quit. Progress came in small victories. 1 foot deeper, one wall straightened, one stubborn rock finally pried loose. Rain turned the pit into mud more than once, forcing her to bail water before she could dig again. Some layers of stone slowed her to half speed. What should have taken just over a month stretched into nearly 2. 52 days after she started, in late October, the hole finally reached its full depth. 35 cubic yards of earth had been moved by hand. Most people would have stopped there, satisfied just to be done. Maggie only wiped her hands and began the next phase. She needed stone, hundreds of them. She gathered limestone and granite from her land in nearby woods. Some fit in one hand. Others weighed 20 pounds and scraped her arms raw as she carried them. She stacked the stones carefully against the earthen walls, dry-fitting them without mortar. Each stone had to support the ones above it. Gaps were intentional, allowing air to move and moisture to escape. The walls slowly rose, layer by layer, until they reached within 2 feet of ground level. The stonework took 3 weeks. By mid-November, the nights were already bitter. Frost coated the ground each morning. Maggie worked faster, knowing winter was close. She built the roof frame from split logs, laying heavy beams across the width of the pit, spacing them 3 feet apart. Smaller poles crossed over them, forming a strong grid. She excavated a sloped ramp 8 feet long, gentle enough to walk safely even with an armload of wood. At the bottom of the ramp, she framed a doorway. The door itself came from salvaged boards, hung on leather straps and iron pins taken from her late husband's old shed. It closed tight and solid. Finally, she covered the roof with layers of bark and sod, then packed 2 feet of earth over it. When she finished, the shed nearly disappeared into the land. Just a low mound and a narrow ramp gave any hint of what lay beneath. Inside, the chamber was cool, dark, and dry, 10 by 16 feet, 6 feet high at the center, stone walls holding steady. The air felt clean, calm, constant. In early December, before the heavy snow arrived, Maggie moved her firewood underground. Armload by armload, she carried it down the ramp and stacked it carefully, leaving space for air to circulate. Oak, maple, and birch, organized by type. The best seasoned wood near the entrance. 4 cords filled the chamber easily, leaving room to move. That was when the neighbors came to see. Some shook their heads. Some laughed outright. Robert Henderson, who farmed the land next to hers, did not bother hiding his opinion. He told her she had built a root cellar for firewood, said she had wasted 3 months of labor on something useless. Underground was damp. The wood would rot. She would see. Maggie answered calmly. Underground, below the frost line, stayed dry. The temperature stayed steady. The wood would stay seasoned. Henderson walked away unconvinced. December passed. January followed. Each evening, Maggie descended into her underground shed, stepping from biting cold into 50-degree air. The wood was always dry, never frozen. It lit easily and burned clean. Her stove produced steady heat with little smoke. She burned less wood than ever before. Outside, winter tightened its grip on Bayfield, and soon it would test every belief the town held about firewood, warmth, and who had been foolish all along. By the time the cold finally loosened its grip on Bayfield, people no longer laughed when they passed Maggie Sullivan's land. The jokes had dried up along with their frozen firewood piles. What replaced them was quiet respect, mixed with a little embarrassment that one young widow had seen something so obvious while the rest of them had followed habit without thinking. The Arctic cold lifted slowly after February 18th. The wind eased first. Then the sky softened from hard steel gray to pale winter blue. Temperatures climbed back to 0, then to 10 above. For most families, the damage had already been done. Wood piles were gone or nearly gone. Furniture had been burned. Savings were spent. Pride had been swallowed. Maggie came through the winter without crisis. She used just over 4 cords of wood by the time March arrived. She still had dry logs stacked neatly underground. Her house stayed warm. Her stove stayed clean. She slept through the nights without waking to feed a dying fire. Word spread beyond Bayfield as neighbors told relatives and friends in nearby towns what they had seen. An underground woodshed that stayed dry in -20 weather. Firewood that never froze. A woman who heated her home while others struggled, not through strength or luck, but through understanding. Robert Henderson returned again in late February, this time with paper and a pencil. He asked Maggie to walk him through the design step by step. How deep, how wide, how to line the walls, how to build the roof. She showed him everything. She did not boast. She explained calmly, the same way she always had. By spring, requests came from all directions. Families asked if she would look at their land and tell them where a shed could be built safely. She checked soil, slope, and drainage. She explained that depth mattered more than size, that water flow mattered more than tradition, that stone walls were not decoration, but structure and airflow. She never charged much. Sometimes she accepted a few dollars. Sometimes firewood. Sometimes nothing at all. She remembered how it felt to face winter alone and afraid. Through the summer of 1895, Bayfield changed. Holes appeared in backyards and fields. Men who had once laughed now dug with care. Women hauled stones and learned how to stack them properly. Children watched and asked questions. 8 underground woodsheds were completed before the next snow fell. That winter told the final truth. Families using underground storage burned far less wood than they ever had before. Fires lit easily. Houses stayed warmer. Smoke no longer filled kitchens. The difference was so clear that no one argued about it anymore. The numbers spoke for themselves. 2 cords saved per winter, sometimes more. For families living close to the edge, that mattered. Less money spent. Less labor cutting and hauling wood. Less fear when storms came early or stayed long. Maggie's shed became the model. People copied it carefully. 10 feet by 16, 6 feet deep, stone-lined, earth roof, sloped ramp. Some made theirs bigger, some smaller. The principle stayed the same. Maggie remarried a few years later to a carpenter who admired her mind as much as her strength. He did not try to improve her design. He understood that it already worked. Together they raised 3 children. The woodshed remained in use every winter, unchanged, reliable. Decades passed. Stoves improved. Coal arrived, then oil. Some families stopped using wood entirely, but the dugout sheds remained, quiet and solid beneath the earth. Those who kept burning wood still used them. They still worked. When Maggie died in 1938, her obituary spoke of her kindness, her family, and the strange underground shed she had built long ago that saved a town during a hard winter. People remembered the cold of 1895 and how wrong they had been. Long after her death, inspectors measured the shed. The humidity stayed low. The temperature stayed steady. Everything Maggie had understood at her kitchen table proved true. She had never set out to change a town. She only wanted to survive winter without waste. But sometimes, survival teaches lessons stronger than tradition. And sometimes the person digging a hole sees farther than the one standing above ground. When the cold finally began to loosen its grip on Bayfield, it did not arrive all at once. It crept back slowly, day by day, as if winter itself was reluctant to admit defeat. The wind softened first, then the sky lost its hard gray edge. Temperatures climbed from -20 to -5, then finally to numbers above 0. For many families, the damage had already been done. Wood piles were gone or badly depleted. Furniture had been burned. Savings meant for spring seed or repairs had been spent just to survive February. People were exhausted, thin, and quietly humbled. Winter had exposed every weakness in their planning. Maggie Sullivan came through it differently. By early March, she counted her remaining wood. She had burned just over 4 cords since December. Nearly a full cord still sat stacked neatly in her underground shed, dry as the day she carried it down the ramp. Her house had stayed warm the entire winter. Her stovepipe was clean. Her hands were not cracked from fighting damp wood and smoky fires. She had slept through the nights while others rose every 2 hours to feed stoves that could not keep up. The laughter that once followed her name was gone. Robert Henderson was the first to admit it openly. In late February, he came again to Maggie's property, this time carrying paper and a pencil instead of doubt. He asked her to explain everything from the beginning: how deep the pit needed to be, why stone mattered, why the roof had to be covered with earth, why the ramp angle mattered in winter. Maggie answered patiently, just as she always had. Others followed. Families who had avoided her before now walked the long road in bitter wind just to see the shed again. They stepped down into the chamber and felt the steady 50-degree air. They touched the dry wood with disbelief. Some stood silent for a long time, understanding settling in slowly. By the time March arrived, the truth was accepted. The dugout woodshed was not foolish. It was better. Spring of 1895 became a season of digging. Across Bayfield and the nearby countryside, people marked out rectangles with stakes and string, just as Maggie had done the year before. Men who had farmed all their lives learned to think differently about soil and water. Women hauled stones and learned how to stack them so walls would hold without mortar. Children watched and carried smaller rocks, listening as Maggie explained why depth mattered more than size. She visited each site when asked. She checked drainage. She warned against shallow digging. She explained that underground did not mean wet if you understood the land. She never spoke down to anyone. She simply shared what she knew. By autumn, 8 underground woodsheds stood finished around Bayfield. Each one was a variation of Maggie's original design: rectangular pits, 6 to 8 feet deep, stone-lined walls, earth-covered roofs, sloped ramps. They were simple, strong, and nearly invisible once completed. The winter of 1895 arrived quietly, without the violence of the year before. Still, it was cold enough to test every system, and the results were impossible to ignore. Families using underground storage burned far less wood than they ever had. Some saved 2 cords. Some saved more. Fires lit easily. Smoke no longer filled kitchens. Houses stayed warmer with less effort. The savings were real. At $3 a cord, 2 cords meant money that could buy food, clothing, or tools. Over 10 winters it meant security. The change lasted. As years passed, new fuels arrived. Coal became common. Later, oil. Some families stopped burning wood altogether. But those who did kept their dugout sheds. They still worked. They still kept wood dry through rain, snow, and deep cold. The sheds needed almost no repair. The stone walls held. The earth roofs protected. The ground did what it always had. Maggie remarried in 1900 to a carpenter who admired careful thinking more than tradition. He never tried to improve her shed. He understood it already, did exactly what it was meant to do. Together they raised 3 children in the same small house, warming it each winter with dry wood from the ground beneath their feet. Maggie lived another 30 years. When she died in 1938, people remembered her kindness, her strength, and the winter she had quietly proven everyone wrong. Her obituary mentioned the underground woodshed, the one that kept a town warm when nothing else worked. Long after her death, inspectors measured the shed. The temperature stayed steady. The air stayed dry. Everything Maggie had calculated by lamplight decades earlier proved true. She had never tried to change the world. She only wanted to survive winter without waste. But sometimes, understanding one simple truth is enough to change how everyone else sees the ground beneath their feet.